headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Good morning, Richard. Thank you for joining us. First of all, your thoughts on the last 24 hours. Did you ever think you would see such a conflict in 21st century Europe?
Well, we've seen similar conflicts in 21st century Europe, and let's not forget about Russia's occupation of the Crimea in 2014. And indeed, we've seen other Russian aggression elsewhere in Europe. So it's not a complete surprise, and it's even less of a surprise because Western intelligence published by the US and the UK predicted exactly what's happening now with pretty great confidence. I suspect it was something that could have been averted had maybe the West behaved more strongly towards Russia over the years, and particularly in recent months. But I think given that they didn't, it was an inevitability.
I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but I thought this might amuse you. Your friends in the Taliban, the Afghan government, have issued a statement expressing their extreme concern about the situation in Ukraine and the real possibility of civilian casualties, and they call upon both sides of this conflict to resolve the crisis through dialogue and peaceful means. Of course, the Taliban being the epitome of a government that loves to resolve matters through peaceful and dialogue, peaceful means. You couldn't make it up, could you?
No, well, my friends in the Taliban have enjoyed a great deal of support over many years from Russia. Russia has funded them, it's provided training for them, and it's gaining influence now in Afghanistan as we speak. So I think both sides have little respect for any kind of peaceful behaviour, and so I think they're both pretty good bedfellows, Russia and the Taliban. Indeed.
I should have warned you, Richard. We may have to cut to the House of Commons, where the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace is about to make a statement to the nation. But in the meantime, let's continue our conversation. I think Vladimir Putin is deranged. I think his ambitions are mad. His expansionism is insane. However, this does look like a well-planned military invasion of Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, he's been building up his forces since last year. He's been preparing the ground. He obviously has agents on the ground in Ukraine as well as his armed forces to help them. And he's put in place all the resources he needs for, I think, a fairly swift overrunning of large parts of Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainian forces have been fighting quite strongly in some areas, and it may be that it's not as easy a nut to crack as he may have thought. But I think ultimately he's in a position to take over the country, to bring down the government. Whether he has sufficient forces to sustain a long-term occupation of Ukraine, if that's what he has in mind, I think is more questionable. And it could be that a protracted guerrilla war, a resistance operation by Ukraine, could be very, very damaging for Russia and for Putin personally.
Indeed. We've had a couple of MPs from Ukraine on the show live from the war zone this morning, and it's been heartbreaking to hear them. And we've also heard from President Zelensky this morning pleading for more help from the West, that they're appreciative of these tough economic sanctions, but economic sanctions take a long time to take effect, sometimes at least a month. Joe Biden spoke of that last night. Economic sanctions do not stop children being killed. They are asking at least for weapons, possible air support. Do we need, we can go on about them not being a NATO country till the cows come home, but do we have a moral obligation to help this innocent country in its hour of need with more than just economic sanctions?
Yeah, well, I think the economic sanctions that have been agreed by the EU and even the stronger ones from Britain are still not particularly tough and won't have any effect on Putin's war in Ukraine. They might have a longer term effect and might deter future aggression, possibly, but he's factored it all in. So this is not the battleground that we should be focusing on. We should do it, But I certainly think that, in response to Ukraine's request for more weaponry, we should provide it. We should certainly, Britain, I don't know about the other European countries, Britain certainly should step up its arms supplies to Ukraine now. That's not an easy thing to do in the middle of a war with Russia gaining increasing dominance over the Ukrainian airspace. It would probably require either an air corridor to be established to bring weapons in using NATO combat planes, or a land corridor. But I think we should certainly do that. We should do everything we can to help keep the Ukrainian army fighting, and then, if necessary, to support a resistance movement. That doesn't just include providing weapons, it also includes providing intelligence, surveillance, cyber warfare support, etc.
I mean, militarily, Richard, if you don't stand up to a bully like Putin, he just will keep on advancing. And there are many fears increasing right now that Ukraine is just the start of his crazed ambitions, and that he intends to march on towards the Baltic states, which, of course, are NATO allies. And at that point, we'd be obliged to get involved. So we might as well do it sooner rather than later.
Well, I think you're right. What this smacks of throughout is appeasement and weakness in the United States and in Europe. And the origins, I believe, of the direct origins of this conflict are the withdrawal from Afghanistan by NATO and the US, which showed weakness and emboldened him. As far as, the only way to deal with a despot like Putin is to show him strength. If he sees weakness, he goes for it. And you mentioned that, he may have his sights set on the Baltic states in the future. I agree with that. But I don't agree necessarily that NATO countries will fight for the Baltic states. I know they have a treaty obligation in NATO to do so, but I think that's still a matter of question whether they would actually muster up the courage to effectively to join what would become a full-scale European war. They should do, of course. They have that obligation, but I think there's so much weakness and appeasement is kind of ingrained in European countries today that I would have my doubts.
Yeah. You're so right. Afghanistan, the debacle of the evacuation from Afghanistan, I think emboldened not only Putin but also China as well. But it's impossible, Richard, to avoid chilling comparisons to the build-up to the Second World War. We had another madman, Adolf Hitler, expanding like crazy, expansionism, and we allowed him to go into one country and we said, OK, you can have Austria. And then we allowed him to go into the next and the next and the next. And in the end, he went into Poland and we had to declare war. So once again, can we not learn the lesson of history and realise that if we stand back and just let him take Ukraine, that could be just the start of something catastrophic?
Well, let's not forget, it wasn't just Hitler who was the madman invading countries in the 1930s. It was also Joseph Stalin, the Russian dictator.
Yeah.
Putin is following on in his footsteps, and I think has a degree of respect and admiration for Stalin, and indeed, no doubt, for Hitler as well. But that lesson should have been learnt back then. But unfortunately, in the intervening years, it's been forgotten. And European countries have become so used to a comfortable standard of living where war is at a distance, thousands of miles away, if anywhere. It's become an anathema. It's become something they don't want to fight. Now, war is extremely unpleasant. Of course it is. We all know that. It's very damaging. It kills people in large numbers sometimes and should be avoided whenever possible, but not at all costs. And sometimes to stand up to a dictator like Putin and to use military force against him, sometimes that can lead to a lesser conflict further downstream, as may have happened had we behaved differently in the 1930s. And I think that's why it's really important that Western countries now do everything they can to stand up and back Ukraine at the moment. There's no sign of that, I have to say, but that's what should be happening. But
that would be your call, not necessarily boots on the ground, but military assistance, possibly forming an air corridor, possibly even air cover, and sending them weapons, because if we don't do that, we will effectively just sit back and watch it happen. Heartbreaking pictures in the newspapers today of little kids huddled in bomb shelters. We know among the death toll, the the rising death toll. There are many innocent civilians, including children. We've got to do something to stop this. Not just say we'll freeze your bank accounts, haven't we?
Yeah, I agree, and I think every action we can take, we should take. I don't think there's any political will in any European country or any NATO country to deploy forces. So I think we must assume that won't happen. But we should do everything we possibly can short of that. And that includes, it really amounts to not just defending Ukraine, but preempting future Russian aggression. And it really means it's necessary to make it as painful as possible for Russia. The weak sanctions that have been imposed do not do that. Of course, Putin can turn and will turn and has turned to China to fill the gap in any economic damage that's done from Western sanctions. He will also, of course, retaliate. We should turn Russia into a pariah state. I think we should certainly consider expelling Russian diplomats, including the ambassador, and closing down diplomatic relations between Britain and European countries and Russia, bringing back our ambassador from Russia. There's no need to have these diplomats there. Diplomacy, when you're working with Putin, very clearly does not work. So let's turn them into a pariah state and isolate them.
Richard, it's always a pleasure to talk.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.